Hey there. Tonight we're stepping into the wild places, not the marble halls of Olympus or the battlefields of heroes, but into the forests where moonlight filters through ancient branches, where deer step softly through morning mist, and where a goddess walks with bow in hand and starlight in her eyes. You'll drift through the entire story of Artemis, from the moment of her remarkable birth on a wandering island, to the fierce independence she claimed as her birthright, to the myths that made her both protector and punisher, guardian and hunter, the untamed heart of the wilderness itself. You'll meet those who crossed her path, some with devotion, others with foolishness, and a few with love that could never be. You'll walk through sacred groves where privacy was paramount, stand witness to divine vengeance swift as arrows, and understand why the wild places have always belonged to her. If this kind of storytelling helps you rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it actually brings you peace. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It's strangely comforting to know who else is out there, falling asleep to the same ancient stories. So dim the lights, let the forest whisper, let the myths unfold, and let's begin at the very beginning, with a mother fleeing across the face of the earth, and twins who would be born beneath the open sky. Before Olympus knew her name, before the forests learned to quiet when she passed, before the moon became her banner and the hunt her sacred calling, there was only Leto wandering and desperate, carrying within her the children of Zeus, and in those children one would arrive first, already fierce, already knowing what it meant to be free. Her name was Artemis. The story begins, as so many divine stories do, with Zeus and a choice that would echo through generations. Leto was a titaness, daughter of the ancient Curse and Phoebe, quiet and gentle where others were proud and loud. She moved through the world with grace, and that grace caught the eye of the king of gods. Zeus, whose appetites were as legendary as his lightning, desired Leto with the intensity he brought to all such matters. And Leto, flattered and perhaps genuinely moved by his attention, gave herself to him. The union was brief, passionate, and ultimately ruinous for her peace. Because Zeus had a wife. Hera, queen of the gods, guardian of marriage and family, had long since grown accustomed to her husband's wandering affections. But accustomed did not mean accepting, and accepting did not mean forgiving. Each time Zeus strayed, Hera's wrath found not him, who was untouchable in his power, but the women who had caught his eye and the children they bore him. When word reached Hera that Leto was pregnant, carrying not one child but twins, the goddess's fury crystallized into something cold and calculated. She would not kill Leto. That would be too quick, too merciful. Instead, she would ensure that Leto's suffering stretched across months, across the whole face of the earth. Hera sent word to every land, every island, every patch of solid ground that existed. The decree was absolute and terrible in its simplicity. No place on earth, no terra firma, no stable ground would be permitted to give Leto shelter when her time came to give birth. Any land that defied this command would face the eternal wrath of the Queen of Heaven. And so Leto wandered. She walked across Greece, her belly swelling with divine life, her feet aching, her heart growing heavy with each closed door, each turned back, each fearful refusal. The lands knew Hera's power, knew her vindictiveness, knew that to help Leto was to invite destruction. Mountains would not shelter her, plains would not accept her. Forests, as sacred as they would one day become to her daughter, offered no refuge. Leto travelled to Thebes, but the Thebans drove her away. She sought sanctuary in Athens, but the Athenians, wise though they were, would not risk Hera's anger. Every city, every village, every remote homestead turned her aside. Some did so with regret, others with fear, but all did so with finality. The pain of her labour began as she walked. The contractions came in waves, tightening, releasing, tightening again. She had no midwife, no women to hold her hands, no sacred space prepared for birthing. She had only the open road, the indifferent sky, and the growing certainty that she might die undelivered, her children dying with her. But there was one place that Hera's decree could not quite reach, a small island, so insignificant that it barely registered in the geography of the world. It was not fixed to the sea floor, not truly part of the earth in the way other lands were. It floated, drifting on the currents, homeless as Leto herself. The island was called Delos, or sometimes Ortygia, and it had nothing to lose. It had no great cities, no mighty rulers, no prosperity that Hera could threaten. It was barren, rocky, and poor. And perhaps because of this poverty, or perhaps because the floating island felt kinship with a floating, desperate woman, Delos offered what no other place would: welcome. Leto stumbled onto the island's shore, her body racked with pain, her strength nearly spent. The few inhabitants of Delos gathered around her, uncertain but not unkind. They had little to offer her, no palace, no temple, no comfortable birthing chamber. But they had presence, and they had witness, and sometimes that is enough. Leto's labour was long and terrible. The pain of bringing divine life into the world is not like mortal childbirth. It is more intense, more searing, as if the very act of containing godhood strains the boundaries of physical form. For 9 days and 9 nights, Leto laboured, crying out to the sky, to the earth, to any power that might hear her. Hera, watching from Olympus, smiled grimly. She had not yet finished her cruelty. She had one more weapon to deploy. Eileithyia, the goddess of childbirth and midwifery, the one who eased the passage of children into the world, Hera kept her locked away on Olympus. Without Eileithyia, birth could not complete. Without Eileithyia, Leto might labour forever. But the other gods grew uneasy watching Leto's suffering. Even those who feared Hera felt the wrongness of it. The Titaness had done nothing except attract Zeus's attention. Hardly a crime when Zeus himself was the instigator. Her punishment seemed excessive, cruel, pointless. Quietly, carefully, the other gods pooled resources. They sent gifts to Hera, trinkets and treasures and promises, sweet words and sweeter bribes. They whispered that Leto's suffering had surely been punishment enough. They suggested that perhaps Hera had made her point. And finally, grudgingly, Hera relented just enough to let Eileithyia go. The goddess of childbirth descended to Delos like mercy arriving late, and her presence changed everything. The moment she touched Leto's brow, the moment her divine power focused on the labouring woman, the birth became possible, and Artemis came first. She emerged into the world with her eyes already open, already taking in the scene around her. A small island, a desperate mother, the open sky. She was born in the wild under no roof, with no civilization to mark the moment, only stone and sea and stars. And the first thing the infant goddess did, impossibly, miraculously, was understand. She understood that her mother was not finished. She understood that another child remained unborn. She understood that Leto, exhausted beyond measure from bringing forth one divine child, might not survive bringing forth another. So Artemis, moments old, became a midwife. The ancient stories are unclear on exactly how a newborn performed this miracle. Some say she simply held her mother's hand, offering comfort and strength. Others claim she spoke, impossibly, guiding Eileithia's work with wisdom beyond her minutes of existence. Still others suggest something deeper, that divinity recognizes divinity, and Artemis used her own nascent power to ease her twin brother's passage into the world. What all accounts agree on is this: 9 days after Artemis was born, Apollo followed. He came into the world more easily than his sister, the difficult work already done. He arrived to find Artemis watching, waiting, already protective of him, though he was only moments younger. The twins lay together on the rocky ground of Delos, 2 divine children who would grow to be among the most powerful of the Olympian gods. Leto wept with relief and exhaustion. Her ordeal was over. She had survived Hera's cruelty. She had given birth to 2 beautiful children, and one of those children had, in her first moments of life, already demonstrated the fierce independence and surprising compassion that would define her character forever. This was Artemis's first act. Not hunting, not running wild, but helping, being present when a mother needed her, standing between life and death and choosing life. It was fitting, perhaps, that the goddess who would never bear children of her own would enter the world as a midwife. The paradox was already present from the beginning. Delos, for its kindness, received gifts from the gods. Zeus anchored the island to the seabed, making it stable and fixed, a real place at last. He brought prosperity to its people, and the island became one of the most sacred sites in all of Greece. Temples rose there dedicated to Apollo and Artemis both. Pilgrims came from across the known world to honor the twins and the island that had sheltered their mother when no other place would. Leto remained on Delos for some time, nursing her children, letting them grow strong under the island's sun. But even as infants, the twins were remarkable. Apollo glowed with light even in darkness, as if the sun already lived within him. Artemis was quieter, watchful, her eyes tracking movement, following the flight of birds, the scuttle of crabs along the shore. She was, from the very beginning, a creature of attention and observation. She noticed everything, she forgot nothing, and she would carry that sharp awareness with her for eternity. The goddess who always saw, always knew, always remembered both kindness and offense. The twins grew quickly, as divine children do. What takes mortal children years takes gods only days or weeks. Soon they were toddling, then walking, then running. Apollo played with light, coaxing it into different shapes, learning to make shadows dance. Artemis ran, exploring every corner of Delos, every rock pool and hidden cove, every place a small creature might hide. And when they were old enough, when their divine nature had settled into something more permanent, Leto brought them to Olympus to meet their father. Zeus welcomed his children with joy and pride. They were beautiful, both of them, radiant with health and power. Apollo's charm was immediate and warm. Artemis's presence was cooler, more reserved, but no less impressive. She had her mother's dark eyes and something else, something wholly her own, a kind of stillness that suggested depth. When Artemis was 3 years old, Zeus summoned her to his throne. He sat her on his great knee, this small, fierce child who already seemed more self-possessed than many adults, and he asked her a question that parents have asked children since time began. "What would you like, little one? What gifts can I give you?" Now, Zeus expected the usual requests. Toys, perhaps, pretty dresses, sweet things. He had given gifts to mortal children before and found their desires simple and innocent. Artemis was not a mortal child. She looked up at her father with those dark, measuring eyes, and she delivered a list of requests that had clearly been prepared well in advance. She had been thinking about this. She knew exactly what she wanted, and what she wanted was freedom. She spoke clearly, without hesitation, her child's voice somehow carrying the weight of absolute certainty. First, she wanted virginity, eternal and unbroken. She wanted never to marry, never to be given away like a prize or a possession. She wanted to remain her own person, bound to no man, subject to no husband's will. In a world where women, mortal and divine, were constantly married off for alliances and politics, where even goddesses found themselves wed to gods they had not chosen, this was a radical request. Zeus, to his credit, did not laugh or dismiss it. He listened. Second, she wanted her own names, many of them, enough to distinguish her clearly from her twin brother Apollo. She did not want to be just Apollo's sister, defined solely by her relationship to him. She wanted her own identity, her own titles, her own recognition. Third, she wanted a bow and arrows, and she wanted them to be as fine as Apollo's, perhaps even finer. She wanted to be armed, dangerous, capable of defending herself. She wanted to hunt, to match her brother, arrow for arrow, to be as deadly as she was free. Fourth, she wanted a short tunic suitable for running and hunting, not the long constraining dresses that goddesses traditionally wore. She wanted clothing that would let her move without hindrance, that would not catch on branches or slow her down when she chased prey through the forest. Fifth, she wanted nymphs as her companions, 60 daughters of Oceanus, all 9 years old, and 20 Amnesian nymphs to care for her hunting hounds when she was not pursuing game. She wanted a band of followers, companions who would share her life and her values, who would remain virgins like herself and join her in the hunt. And sixth, most importantly, she wanted all the mountains of the world as her domain. She wanted the wilderness, the wild places, the peaks and forests where mortals rarely went. She wanted the land that civilization had not yet tamed. She wanted freedom not just for herself, but in geography, in having spaces that belonged to her and her alone. Zeus listened to all of this, his small daughter sitting on his knee, speaking with the confidence of someone who already knew her own mind completely. And when she finished, he smiled. How could he refuse her? These were not the requests of a greedy child, grasping for toys and sweets. These were the requests of someone who understood exactly who she was and what she needed to be fully herself. Artemis, at 3 years old, had already figured out what many people never learn in an entire lifetime. What she wanted was not power over others, but power over her own fate. Zeus granted every wish. He nodded his great head, and with that nod, reality shifted to accommodate his daughter's will. Artemis would remain virgin forever, untouchable, unassailable in her independence. She received titles: Artemis Potnia Theron, Mistress of Animals; Artemis Agratera, the Huntress; Artemis Elaphebelos, Deerslayer; Artemis Locaia, Helper in Childbirth. Each name a facet of her identity, each title her own. Zeus summoned Hephaestus, god of the forge, and commanded him to craft for Artemis a bow of silver and arrows that would never miss their mark. The craftsman god, always meticulous in his work, created weapons of surpassing beauty and perfect function. The bow curved like a crescent moon, the arrows straight as intention itself. When Artemis held them, they felt not like tools, but like extensions of her own will. The Cyclopes, those one-eyed smiths who had crafted Zeus's thunderbolts, added their own gift. They gave her a quiver that would never empty, so that she need never fear running out of arrows mid-hunt. They gave her arrowheads that could pierce any hide, penetrate any defense, strike down any target. In their forge beneath the earth, they had hammered divinity into metal, and the result sang with power. Zeus called forth nymphs from all corners of the world. They came willingly, these daughters of rivers and oceans, drawn by the promise of running wild with a goddess who would never force them into marriages they did not choose. 60 daughters of Oceanus arrived, each 9 years old in appearance, each swearing the same oath of eternal virginity that Artemis herself had taken. 20 Amnesian nymphs came from Crete, skilled in animal husbandry, ready to care for the hounds that would join the divine hunt. The goddess Athena, hearing of her young half-sister's requests, wove for her a short hunting tunic, the kind worn by mortal hunters and warriors. It left her arms and legs free, was sturdy enough to withstand thorns and rough terrain, yet light enough not to hinder her movements. The fabric was woven with protective charms, subtle magic that would turn aside minor injuries, keep her comfortable in heat or cold. It was practical, functional, perfect. And finally, Zeus declared that all the mountains, all the wild places, all the untamed forests and rocky peaks, from one end of the earth to the other, these belonged to Artemis. They were her domain, her kingdom, her responsibility, and her joy. Cities could belong to other gods. Seas and skies and underworlds could be divided among his brothers. But the wilderness, the beautiful untouched wilderness, that was Artemis's alone. She stood before her father, no longer on his knee but on her own feet, armed and equipped, named and sovereign. She was still a child, still small, but there was nothing childish about the way she carried herself. She had asked for what she needed, and having received it, she was ready to claim it. Artemis left Olympus that same day and descended to earth. Her band of nymphs followed her, chattering and excited, 60 voices like birdsong. The Amnesian nymphs brought hounds, great hunting dogs with keen noses and powerful legs, bred for endurance and tracking. They moved as a group down from the divine mountain, through the foothills into the forests. And there, in the green cathedral of ancient trees, Artemis found her home. She ran through the woods with her nymphs, learning the way light fell through leaves at different times of day, memorizing the paths that deer took to water, finding the places where wild things slept and fed and raised their young. She practiced with her bow, shooting at targets until her aim was perfect, then shooting while running until she could hit moving targets without thought or hesitation. Her arrows always flew true, guided by divine will and Cyclops' craft. The hounds loved her immediately. They recognized in her something that spoke to their own wild natures. They obeyed her perfectly, not out of fear, but out of devotion. When she called, they came. When she hunted, they tracked with ferocious precision. When she rested, they lay at her feet, content to be near her. Artemis discovered that she could speak to animals, not in words, but in something deeper, an understanding that transcended language. She knew what the deer were thinking when they froze at her approach. She understood the bear's territorially protective aggression. She felt the wolf's hunger and the rabbit's fear. The wild was not separate from her. She was part of it, woven into its rhythms and patterns as natural as rain or wind. But she was also its hunter. This was the paradox at her heart, the tension that would define her forever. She loved the wild things, understood them, even protected them from wanton slaughter and cruel treatment. But she also hunted them, killed them, took their lives with arrows swift and sure. There was no contradiction in her mind. The hunt was sacred. The kill was necessary. Life and death were not opposites, but partners in an eternal dance. When she hunted, she did so with respect. She took only what was needed, never killed for sport or mere amusement. She preferred quick, clean kills, one arrow through the heart or throat, death coming before the animal even understood it was wounded. She wasted nothing. The meat fed her nymphs and herself. The hides became clothing. The bones were returned to the earth or used for tools. Every part of the animal was honored. Her nymphs learned from her. They learned to move quietly through the forest, to read tracks, to understand weather and terrain. They learned to pull their bowstrings with proper form, to breathe steadily before releasing an arrow, to follow through with their shots. They learned which plants were edible, which herbs could heal wounds, which berries would make them sick. They became as wild as she was, tanned by sun, hardened by constant movement, fierce and free. Artemis rarely visited cities. She had no interest in the politics of mortals or even the intrigues of Olympus. She appeared at her father's court only when summoned or when something particularly important required her presence. She had no palace, no throne room, no courtiers or supplicants. Her throne was a moss-covered rock in a forest clearing. Her courtiers were deer and wolves. Her supplicants were women in labor, calling her name in their pain, asking for her help. Because despite never bearing children herself, despite her eternal virginity, Artemis became the goddess women called upon in childbirth. Perhaps it was because of her first act, helping Leto deliver Apollo. Perhaps it was because the nymphs who attended her were skilled in midwifery, knowledge they passed to mortal women who worshipped the goddess. Or perhaps it was because Artemis understood that childbirth was its own kind of wildness, primal and powerful and dangerous, a threshold between life and death that required both strength and surrender. Women in labor would cry out to her, "Artemis Lokeia, helper of childbirth, ease my pain. Artemis Kuratrophos, nurse of youth, keep my baby safe." And Artemis, running through distant forests, would hear them. Sometimes she sent relief. Sometimes she sent her nymphs to act as midwives. And sometimes, for reasons mortals could not understand, she sent nothing at all. And the woman died screaming her name. Because Artemis was not a goddess of comfort or gentleness or nurturing in the way mortals often wanted goddesses to be. She was a goddess of wilderness, and wilderness is neither kind nor cruel. It simply is. Babies are born in blood and pain. Sometimes mothers die. Sometimes babies die. This is the nature of the wild, and Artemis did not sweeten it with false comfort, but she did honor it. Every woman who died in childbirth was said to have been struck down by Artemis's arrows, not as punishment, but as recognition. Those deaths were not meaningless. They were sacred in the way that all death in the wild is sacred. The woman had crossed a threshold, gone into the dark place where new life emerges, and sometimes the price of that crossing was her own life. Artemis witnessed those deaths. She honored them. She carried those souls to wherever they needed to go. In the forests and mountains that were her domain, Artemis established sacred spaces. Certain groves were hers alone. Certain springs were for her use and the use of her nymphs. Mortals who stumbled upon these places were expected to leave immediately, quietly, without looking back. Those who lingered, who tried to spy on the goddess or her attendants, who violated the privacy of these sacred spaces, learned that Artemis's patience had limits. Her sacred animals were many. The deer, especially the red deer and the stag, swift and graceful. The bear, powerful and maternal. The boar, dangerous and fierce. The wolf, loyal and deadly. The dog, companion of hunters. All of these were under her protection. To harm them wantonly was to invite her wrath. To hunt them respectfully was to honor her. The distinction mattered. She had sacred plants as well. The cypress tree, tall and dark and eternal. The willow, which grew by water and wept with grace. The amaranth flower, which never faded. Laurel, though that was also sacred to her brother Apollo. Wormwood, bitter and powerful. These plants marked her places, grew thick in her groves, were used by her followers in rituals and medicine. Mortal hunters learned to make offerings to her before the hunt. A piece of the first kill would be left at a shrine, dedicated to Artemis Agrotera. Prayers would be spoken. Let my arrow fly true. Let my hunt be clean. Let me kill swiftly and with respect. Thank you, Artemis, for the bounty of the wild. Those who remembered to honor her found that their hunts went well. Their arrows found their marks. Their game was plentiful. Their journeys through wild places were safe from predators and bad weather. Artemis rewarded those who showed proper respect. Those who forgot, or worse, who mocked her, learned different lessons. There was a young hunter named Actaeon. He was the son of Aristaeus, a minor god of useful arts like beekeeping and cheese-making, and Autonoe, a mortal princess of Thebes. This mixed heritage gave Actaeon certain advantages. He was stronger than normal mortals, faster, with sharper senses and longer endurance. He was also arrogant, as those with advantages often are. Actaeon became famous throughout Boeotia for his hunting prowess. He trained under Chiron, the wise centaur who taught heroes and learned everything the old teacher could impart about tracking, about reading the forest, about understanding animal behavior. He assembled a pack of 50 hunting dogs, each bred for specific talents. Some were fast coursers who could chase down deer. Others were powerful holders who could bring down boar. Still others were scent hounds who could track a blood trail for miles. He named each dog, trained them rigorously, and together they became the most formidable hunting party in all of Greece. But Actaeon had a flaw, and that flaw was pride. He began to believe that he was the greatest hunter who had ever lived. He boasted in the taverns and marketplaces that no quarry could escape him, that no creature was too clever or too fast for his hounds and his skill. Some versions of the story say he claimed to be a better hunter than Artemis herself. Others say he merely grew careless about showing respect, forgetting to make offerings, neglecting the proper prayers. Either way, his hubris drew the goddess's attention. One hot afternoon in summer, Actaeon was hunting on Mount Cithaeron with his companions and his pack of hounds. They had been out since dawn, and by midday they had killed several deer and a young boar. The hunting had been good, the day successful. Actaeon's companions were tired and ready to return home, but Actaeon wanted to continue, to push deeper into the mountain forests, to find something more challenging, more worthy of his reputation. His friends tried to dissuade him. It was the hottest part of the day. The animals would be sleeping in shade, impossible to find. Better to return home, eat, drink, rest, and hunt again in the evening when the temperature dropped and the game emerged to feed. But Actaeon insisted. He sent his companions home with the game they had killed and took his hounds deeper into the forest, following a promising trail that suggested deer had passed through recently. The dogs ran ahead, noses to the ground, tails wagging with enthusiasm. Actaeon followed, bow in hand, eyes scanning the undergrowth for movement. The forest grew thicker as he climbed. The trees pressed close together, their branches forming a canopy that blocked most of the sunlight. The air was cooler here, almost cold despite the summer heat. A stream ran nearby. He could hear its quiet burbling, the splash and ripple of water over stone. His hounds headed toward it, thirsty after hours of running. Actaeon followed them to the stream and stopped. There was a pool here, fed by a waterfall that dropped from rocks above, crystal clear and cold, surrounded by ferns and moss. The water looked perfect, refreshing, exactly what he and his dogs needed. He was about to kneel and drink when he noticed something that made him freeze. Someone was already there. In the center of the pool, waist deep in clear water, was a woman. Her back was to him, her dark hair streaming wet down her shoulders, her skin pale in the dappled shade. She was bathing, clearly washing away the sweat and dust of the day. Around her, other women also bathed, younger, laughing softly, splashing water at each other. Nymphs, Actaeon realized. These were nymphs, which meant the woman in the center, the one who commanded attention even with her back turned, who seemed to make the very air around her sharp with presence. She was no ordinary nymph. A small, rational part of Actaeon's mind told him to leave. Immediately, quietly, without looking back. Sacred pools were sacred for a reason. Goddesses and nymphs did not appreciate mortal men stumbling upon them during private moments. The correct response was to avert his eyes, to back away silently, to pretend he had never been there. But Actaeon did not leave. Perhaps he was too shocked to move. Perhaps his pride made him believe he had a right to be anywhere he chose. Perhaps simple human curiosity held him frozen. Or perhaps some small piece of divine will ensured that he stayed, that he bore witness, that the story could unfold the way it needed to. Whatever the reason, Actaeon remained where he stood, half hidden behind the ferns, and he watched. The woman in the pool turned slightly and he caught a glimpse of her profile. She was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with softness or invitation. Her beauty was sharp, austere, the kind that made you think of winter mornings and stone monuments. Her face had a fierce intelligence, eyes that missed nothing even when closed in relaxation. Artemis. He realized it in the same instant that she sensed his presence. She had not heard him. His approach had been silent, learned from years of stalking game. She had not seen him, his position was concealed, but she felt him, the way a deer feels a predator's gaze, the way the wild knows when it is being watched. Her head snapped toward the ferns where he stood, and her eyes found him through the leaves. The nymphs screamed. They rushed toward their goddess, trying to shield her with their bodies, but they were shorter than Artemis, and their attempts at modesty were futile. Artemis stood alone in the pool, water running down her skin, fully visible to this mortal man who had no right to see her, and her face transformed with rage. Actaeon later could not say what frightened him more, the anger in her eyes or the cold calculation that followed it. This was not hot fury, not explosive violence. This was measured, deliberate punishment, the kind that comes from a mind that understands exactly how to hurt someone most effectively. She had no bow, no weapon at hand. Her divine tools were back on the bank with her clothes and quiver, but she did not need them. She scooped up water in her palm and flung it at Actaeon with a single word that might have been a curse or might have been his death sentence. The water struck him full in the face, and agony followed immediately. His skull felt like it was splitting. Something was pushing from inside, trying to break through bone and skin. He tried to scream, but his voice came out wrong, a bellowing cry that was animal, not human. His hands went to his head and found antlers, growing, branching, spreading wider than his reach, heavy as bone because they were bone, his bone erupting from his skull, his body convulsed, muscles reshaped themselves, bones lengthened and thinned, his hands became hooves, his feet hardened into cloven points, fur sprouted from his skin, brown and dappled like the deer he had hunted his entire life, his neck stretched, his face pushed forward into a muzzle. He tried to speak, to apologize, to explain, but the human words would not come. His throat could only produce the sounds of a stag, the bellow and snort that deer make when alarmed. His mind remained human, trapped in an animal's body, aware of every horrible detail of his transformation. When the change completed, he stood on 4 legs instead of 2, and Artemis stood on the bank of her pool, clothed now by her nymphs, as wrathful and terrible as any god who has been violated by mortal presumption. She spoke to him. Her voice was cold, without pity. Since you enjoyed watching me bathe, since you took pleasure in seeing what you had no right to see, now you may experience what it means to be prey rather than predator. You have lived as a hunter, die as the hunted. Actaeon tried to cry out, to beg for mercy, but only deer sounds emerged. He turned to flee, his new body awkward, his 4 legs tangling, his antlers catching on low branches. Behind him, he heard his hounds baying. They had found him, at last following his scent through the forest to this clearing, and they saw a magnificent stag. Actaeon tried to run, but 50 hunting dogs against 1 frightened deer is no contest. They had been trained by him to pull down stags. They were the best hunting pack in Boeotia. They did what they had been bred and trained to do. They pursued. He ran faster than he ever had as a human, the panic lending his animal body speed. But his hounds were faster, bred for this, born for this. The coursers caught him first, snapping at his legs, hamstringing him. He fell, and the holders were on him in an instant, powerful jaws closing on his throat, his belly, his flanks. He felt everything. His human mind was fully aware, trapped in the dying body of the stag, unable to make his beloved hounds understand that he was their master, that they were killing the man who had fed them and trained them and loved them. They did not recognize him. How could they? He smelled like prey. He moved like prey. He bled like prey. The killing took too long. That was perhaps the worst part. A skilled hunter would have delivered a mercy stroke, would have ended it quickly. But hunting dogs are not trained to be merciful. They are trained to bring down game and hold it until the hunter arrives to make the kill. Actaeon's pack did their job perfectly, terribly, holding the stag that had once been their master, waiting for the hunter who would never come because the hunter was the prey. When he finally died, when the pain stopped and the terrible awareness faded, his companions found the scene. They had heard the hound's triumphant baying and come to see what great stag they had brought down. They found the pack clustered around a kill, covered in blood, panting with exertion. But there was no sign of Actaeon. Some say the hounds mourned him, sensing somehow that they had done something wrong, that the scent of their master was mixed with the scent of the stag they had killed. Others say they never understood, that they remained proud of their kill, waiting for praise that would never come. Either way, the pack eventually dispersed, masterless, and returned to the wild from which they had been bred. In some versions of the story, Chiron the centaur, who had trained Actaeon, created a statue of the young hunter so lifelike that the hounds believed their master had returned. They settled near the statue, comforted by the familiar form, growing old in the service of a dead man rendered in stone. The morale of Actaeon's death was debated for generations. Some said he was punished justly for violating Artemis's privacy, for looking upon her nakedness without permission, for transgressing the sacred boundaries between mortal and divine. Others said the punishment was too harsh, that he had stumbled upon the pool by accident, that his intentions had not been malicious, that death was excessive for the crime of seeing. But Artemis did not debate. She did not explain or justify. She had established boundaries clear and absolute. The wilderness was hers, her bathing pools were hers, her privacy was hers. To violate those boundaries was to invite death, whether the violation was intentional or accidental, malicious or merely careless. The story spread. Mortals learned to be more cautious in the deep forests. Hunters learned to make proper offerings before entering the wild places. Men learned to avert their eyes if they accidentally glimpsed something they should not see. The lesson was simple. Artemis demanded respect, and the price of disrespect was always, always too high. But Actaeon's was not the only tragedy that unfolded in Artemis's presence. Her fierce protection of her virgin status and her equally fierce demand for loyalty from her companions led to other sorrows, other transformations, other deaths that echoed through the centuries. The story of Callisto begins with devotion and ends with stars. Callisto was one of Artemis's nymphs, part of that sacred band of companions who had sworn eternal virginity and dedicated their lives to the hunt. She was beautiful, though not vain about it. She was skilled with bow and spear, though not boastful. She was loyal to Artemis, though not in a way that demanded recognition. In all ways, she was exactly the kind of follower the goddess valued, competent, quiet, devoted. She had been born mortal, daughter of King Lycaon of Arcadia, though some stories say she was a nymph from the beginning, daughter of one of the river gods. Either way, she caught the attention of Zeus. This was, in almost all circumstances, a catastrophe waiting to happen. Zeus, king of the gods, desired what he desired with the absolute certainty of someone who had never been refused anything. When he saw Callisto running through the forests of Arcadia, beautiful and free and utterly devoted to his daughter Artemis, he wanted her, not with love, not with anything resembling respect, but with the entitled appetite that had gotten so many other women killed or transformed or ruined. Zeus knew that Callisto had sworn a vow of virginity. He knew she was under Artemis's protection. He knew that approaching her as himself would result in immediate rejection. So he did what he always did when faced with obstacles. He cheated. He disguised himself. In some versions of the story, he took the form of Artemis herself. He appeared to Callisto looking and sounding exactly like her beloved goddess, speaking in Artemis's voice, smiling with Artemis's stern smile. When Callisto approached him, trusting and unsuspecting, he embraced her. And in that embrace, before she could understand what was happening, he took what she had never offered. The violation was complete and terrible. Callisto, who had sworn to remain virgin, who had dedicated her life to chastity and the hunt, was raped by the king of gods wearing the face of the goddess she worshipped. When Zeus disappeared, resuming his true form and returning to Olympus, Callisto was left alone in the forest, confused and traumatized and beginning to understand what had been done to her. She tried to keep it secret. She did not report the violation to Artemis because what could she say? That someone who looked like Artemis had attacked her, that she had been unable to distinguish between her goddess and an impostor. Would Artemis believe her? Would she be accused of making excuses, of having broken her vow willingly, and now trying to blame someone else? So Callisto said nothing. She continued to hunt with Artemis and the other nymphs, acting as if nothing had changed, hoping desperately that nothing would change, that she could simply continue as she had before and forget the horror that had occurred. But Zeus's violations always left evidence. Callisto became pregnant. For months, she managed to hide it. She wore her tunics loose. She kept to the back of the group during hunts. She avoided situations where her changing body might be obvious. But pregnancy, especially divine pregnancy, cannot be concealed forever. The nymphs bathed together in a sacred pool, as they often did after long hunts. The ritual was one of companionship and care, washing away sweat and blood, cooling heated skin, laughing together in the privacy of sacred space. Artemis herself joined them, rare for the goddess to relax so completely, but with her trusted companions she felt safe enough to let her guard down. Callisto tried to refuse, claiming exhaustion or minor injury, any excuse to avoid undressing in front of the others. But Artemis insisted. She knew something was wrong. She had noticed Callisto's strange behavior, her withdrawal, her obvious discomfort. She assumed illness or injury and wanted to help. So Callisto entered the water, and her pregnancy became visible to everyone. The nymphs gasped. Artemis's face went cold and hard. The goddess stood in the pool, water dripping from her skin, and stared at her once faithful companion with a mixture of betrayal and fury that Callisto would remember for the rest of her very long life. "You broke your vow," Callisto tried to explain. She stammered out the story of the violation, of Zeus in disguise, of the horrible realization that had come too late. She wept and pleaded, swearing that she had not willingly broken her oath, that she had been deceived and assaulted, that she remained loyal to Artemis in her heart even if her body had been violated. But Artemis did not want to hear explanations. Artemis, who had demanded and received eternal virginity from her father, who had built her entire identity around remaining untouched and free, who valued purity above almost everything else, saw only that one of her companions had broken the sacred vow. It did not matter to her that the breaking had been forced. It did not matter that Callisto was a victim. All that mattered was that the vow was broken, the trust was shattered, the perfection of her virgin band of companions was corrupted. "Get out." Artemis's voice was flat, final. She did not shout. She did not need to. The two words carried absolute banishment. Callisto tried to approach, to beg for understanding, but Artemis turned her back. The other nymphs followed their goddess's lead, and suddenly Callisto stood alone in the water, cast out from the only family she had known. She left the pool, she gathered her few possessions, and she walked into the wilderness, truly alone for the first time, pregnant and abandoned, with nowhere to go and no one to turn to for help. For Zeus's wife Hera had noticed the pregnancy too, and Hera, seeing yet another mortal woman carrying her husband's child, decided that this time the punishment would be creative. Hera found Callisto in the forest and spoke a single word, and Callisto's form began to change. Not quickly like Actaeon's transformation, but slowly, painfully, over hours. Her body thickened with fur, her hands became paws with long claws, her face pushed forward into a muzzle full of teeth. Her grace disappeared, replaced with the shambling gait of a she-bear. The transformation did not extend to her mind. Callisto remained fully human in consciousness, trapped in a bear's body, unable to speak, unable to make anyone understand who she was. She gave birth in a cave, and the child was human, a son she named Arcus. Somehow Zeus arranged for the baby to be taken to safety, to be raised by others, but Callisto remained a bear, condemned to wander the forests as a beast. Years passed. Arcus grew from infant to child to young man. He became a hunter, trained and skilled, following in the tradition of his homeland. He knew nothing of his true parents. He believed himself an ordinary mortal, though his strength and skill suggested otherwise. One day, hunting in the deep forests of Arcadia, Arcus encountered a bear. It was a large she-bear, old but still powerful, and it did something unexpected. Instead of fleeing or attacking, it approached him directly, steadily, almost as if it recognized him. Callisto had seen her son. After years of wandering as a beast, years of loneliness and despair, she had found him at last, grown and strong and beautiful. She wanted to touch him, to somehow make him understand that she was his mother, that she loved him, that she had never stopped thinking of him every day of her exile. But Arcus saw only a bear approaching him, a dangerous predator that should have fled from a human, but was instead advancing. He did what any hunter would do. He readied his spear, took aim at the creature's heart, and prepared to make the kill. Callisto saw the spear point aimed at her chest and understood that her own son was about to kill her. She did not run. Perhaps she was too shocked. Perhaps she was too weary of her long punishment. Perhaps part of her welcomed the idea of death, of finally escaping the horrible prison of her bear's body. Zeus, watching from Olympus, finally intervened. Some say he felt guilt for having caused all this suffering. Others say he simply wanted to avoid the tragedy of son-killing mother, the pollution that such an act would bring. Whatever his motive, Zeus acted with divine speed, staying Arcus's hand and transforming both mother and son before the spear could fly. Callisto and Arcus were lifted into the sky, their forms shifting one final time. Callisto became the constellation Ursa Major, the Great Bear. Her form spread across the northern heavens. Arcus became Ursa Minor, the Little Bear, forever close to his mother, forever watching over her. It was meant to be an honor, an apotheosis, a transformation from suffering to immortality. But Hera, still vengeful, had one last cruelty to inflict. She went to Tethys and Oceanus, the ancient deities of the world-encircling river, and demanded a favor. She asked them to never allow the bear constellations to dip below the horizon into their waters. And so Callisto and Arches became circumpolar stars, never setting, never resting, condemned to circle the pole star endlessly, without ever touching the cleansing waters of ocean. Other constellations rose and set, appearing and disappearing with the seasons. But the bears remained always visible, always turning, a mother and son transformed into eternal watchers of the night sky. The story of Callisto spread differently than Actaeon's. Where Actaeon's tale was a warning about respecting divine privacy, Callisto's was a tragedy about victimhood, about how even the innocent suffer when gods contend with each other, about how women often pay the price for men's desires and women's rage. But it also added another layer to understanding Artemis's character, the goddess who helped her mother give birth, who protected women in childbirth, who claimed to defend maidens, had banished a maiden who had been raped. The fierce protector was also the fierce punisher. Her standards were absolute. Her judgments were harsh. She did not forgive, did not make exceptions, did not consider context or circumstance when her rules were broken. This inflexibility would appear again and again in her myths, but nowhere would it be more evident or more conflicted than in her encounters with Orion. The story of Artemis and Orion is told in many different ways, with endings that contradict each other and motivations that shift depending on who tells the tale. But what all versions agree on is this: Orion was a giant, a hunter of legendary skill, and somehow, impossibly, he became close to the goddess who allowed no one close. Orion's origins were as confused as the rest of his story. Some said he was the son of Poseidon and Euryale, inheriting his father's connection to the sea and his mother's mortal strength, multiplied to divine proportions. Others told a stranger tale how a childless old man named Hyrieus once hosted Zeus, Poseidon, and Hermes, and in reward for his hospitality, the gods granted him a son born from a bizarre ritual involving a bull's hide and divine urine. That son grew to gigantic size and became Orion. Whatever his parentage, Orion grew to be a man of immense physical presence, tall enough to walk through deep water with his head above the waves, strong enough to carry full-grown cattle, beautiful in the rough, powerful way that mountains are beautiful. And he could hunt. Gods, could he hunt? He tracked game by scent better than any hound. He could shoot a bow with accuracy that rivaled the gods themselves. He understood animal behavior instinctively, knew where prey would run before they knew it themselves. He hunted not just for food, but for joy, for the fierce pleasure of the chase, for the satisfaction of a perfect kill. Naturally, he encountered Artemis. The meeting happened on Crete, in the wild places of that island where the goddess often hunted with her nymphs. Orion was tracking a legendary boar that had been terrorizing villages, and Artemis was pursuing the same creature, having heard prayers from the frightened mortals. They came upon each other in a forest clearing, both ready to take the shot, both equally surprised to find another hunter skilled enough to have tracked the boar this far. Artemis, who avoided the company of men as a rule, who had built her entire existence around independence from male presence, did not immediately drive Orion away. Perhaps she recognized a kindred spirit. Perhaps she was curious about this mortal who could track as well as she could. Perhaps, for the first time in her immortal existence, she felt something like loneliness, and recognized that this giant hunter might understand her in ways her nymphs never could. They hunted the boar together. It was a good hunt, a perfect hunt, the kind where two skilled people work together without needing to speak, anticipating each other's moves, complementing each other's strengths. When they finally brought the boar down, it was impossible to say whose arrow had delivered the killing blow. They had shot simultaneously, and both arrows had found their mark. After that first hunt, there were others. Orion appeared in places where Artemis hunted, and she did not send him away. They tracked deer through mountain passes. They hunted lions in the rocky hills. They shot birds from the sky in competitions to see who had the truest aim. Her nymphs grew used to his presence, though they kept their distance. Even Leto, Artemis's mother, noticed that her daughter had found a companion. For a goddess who had demanded eternal virginity, who had defined herself by her distance from men and romance, this friendship was radical. Orion was not trying to court her. He never made romantic overtures or suggested anything beyond companionship. He treated her as an equal, as a fellow hunter, as someone worthy of respect rather than an object of desire. And Artemis, who had never allowed any man close, found herself enjoying his company. They talked while they walked, long conversations about tracking techniques and weapon maintenance and the habits of different animals. They competed constantly, each trying to outdo the other, but the competition was friendly. sparked more by mutual respect than by genuine rivalry. They sat together on mountainsides in the evening, watching the sun set, comfortable in each other's silence. The other gods noticed. Apollo, Artemis's twin brother, noticed most of all. He saw his sister smiling more, saw her returning from hunts with stories about Orion's skill, saw the way her entire demeanor changed when the giant hunter was present, and Apollo grew worried, and then concerned, and then actively opposed to the developing friendship. Apollo valued his sister's independence as much as she did. He had supported her request for eternal virginity, had helped her maintain her autonomy, had always been protective of her freedom. But now he saw that freedom threatened, not by force or requirement, but by something potentially more dangerous, genuine affection. Artemis was falling in love. She probably did not realize it herself, or if she did, she refused to name it. She would have insisted that Orion was merely a hunting companion, a friend, someone who shared her interests, but her actions suggested otherwise. She sought out his company. She thought of him when he was absent. She defended him when others criticized. And most tellingly, she began to consider the possibility of breaking her vow. Not openly, not in any way she would admit. But the thought was there, small and persistent. What if? What if she allowed herself this one connection? What if she could have companionship without losing independence? What if Orion was different from other men? Apollo watched this internal struggle and decided it could not be allowed to continue. Whether his motives were protectiveness or jealousy or a genuine belief that Artemis would be diminished by marriage, the result was the same. He determined that Orion had to die. But Apollo could not simply kill the giant. That would cause conflict with Artemis, would turn his sister against him, would shatter their own close relationship. So Apollo did what clever gods do. He manipulated events so that Artemis herself would deliver the death blow. The method he chose was cruel and effective. One morning, Apollo came to Artemis with a challenge. He found her by the sea, where she often walked at dawn, and he pointed to a distant object bobbing in the waves far from shore. The sun's reflection made it difficult to see clearly, just a dark spot on the bright water. He told his sister that he doubted her skill with the bow. He suggested that perhaps her recent hunts with Orion had made her soft, that she had lost her edge, that she could no longer hit difficult targets the way she once had. He pointed to the distant object and wagered that she could not hit it from shore. Artemis, who had never lost an archery competition in her life, who could shoot the eye out of a flying bird at twice that distance, rose to the challenge immediately. She nocked an arrow, drew her bow, aimed carefully at the distant target, and released. The arrow flew true as her arrows always did. It crossed the water straight as intention, guided by divine power and perfect technique. It struck the distant object precisely where Artemis had aimed, and the object disappeared beneath the waves. Apollo smiled and congratulated his sister on her impressive shot. Then he suggested they go see what she had hit. Perhaps it was driftwood, perhaps an unusual piece of flotsam. Should they not confirm her victory? They reached the shore where the object had been, and Artemis's world ended. It was Orion, or what remained of Orion. The giant hunter had been swimming in the sea, perhaps bathing, perhaps simply enjoying the water that connected him to his father Poseidon. His head had been above the surface, visible from a great distance, but Apollo's comment about it being driftwood had planted that suggestion in Artemis's mind. She had shot without truly looking, without verifying her target, trusting her brother's implied identification. and she had killed the one person in the world she cared for, beyond her immediate family. The grief that followed was vast and consuming. Artemis did not weep, not at first. She simply stood on the shore looking at Orion's body as the waves carried it to land, unable to process what she had done. When she finally understood, when the reality settled into her bones, she howled. The sound was not human. It was animal, primal, the cry of something broken beyond repair. She tried to undo it. She begged Apollo to bring Orion back, but Apollo, having accomplished his goal, refused. She sought out Asclepius, the god of medicine who had the power to resurrect the dead, but Zeus had already struck him down for that very ability, for blurring the line between mortal and immortal. She prayed to the fates, to the Moirai who wove destiny, but they did not answer. Orion was dead. She had killed him, and nothing could change that. In some versions of the story, Artemis went to Zeus and asked that Orion be placed among the stars so that she could see him every night when she drove her moon chariot across the sky. Zeus agreed, and Orion became a constellation, the giant hunter forever pursuing the Pleiades, forever accompanied by his dog Sirius, forever dying and being reborn with each night's passage. Other versions say that Artemis placed him there herself, using what power she had to ensure that he would never truly be gone, that some part of him would remain visible in the heavens. Either way, the constellation Orion became one of the most prominent in the night sky, unmistakable with its 3-star belt and powerful shoulders. But there are darker versions of the story too, versions where Orion brought his death upon himself through hubris rather than through Apollo's trickery. In these tellings, Orion grew arrogant. Success in the hunt made him boastful. He began to claim that he could kill any animal on earth, that no creature was safe from his prowess, that he would hunt every beast until the world was empty of game. This boast reached the ears of Gaia, Mother Earth herself, who took it as a threat against her children. She created a giant scorpion, massive and deadly, and sent it after Orion. The hunter and the scorpion battled, but even Orion's great strength was no match for the creature's venom. A single sting, and the giant fell dead. Zeus placed both Orion and the scorpion in the sky as constellations, but arranged them so they would never appear together. When Scorpius rises in the east, Orion sets in the west, the hunter forever fleeing from the thing that killed him. Eternal pursuit and eternal escape playing out every night. Still other versions say that Orion tried to force himself on Artemis, or one of her nymphs, and the goddess killed him in rage and defense, shooting him down with her silver arrows. These tellings emphasize Artemis's role as protector of maidens, as punisher of attempted rape, as the swift and terrible consequence of male violence. The truth, if there is a single truth to be extracted from these contradictory accounts, is probably simpler. Artemis and Orion were close, closer than the goddess had ever allowed anyone to be. That closeness threatened her carefully constructed independence, and whether through Apollo's interference, through divine punishment for Orion's hubris, through Artemis's own fear of what she was feeling, or through Orion's own actions, the relationship ended in death, and Artemis returned to her forests alone, harder than before, colder than before, even more fiercely protective of her virginity and her independence. If allowing someone close meant feeling this kind of pain, then she would never allow anyone close again. The lesson was learned, the walls went up, and they would never come down. The story spread among mortals as a warning about different things depending on who told it. Some said it warned men not to pursue goddesses. Others said it warned against hubris and boasting. Still others suggested it was simply a tragedy, proof that even gods could love and lose, that even divine hearts could break. But for Artemis, it was a private wound that never healed. On clear nights when the moon was full and Orion's constellation blazed in the sky, those who looked carefully claimed they could see the moon linger in that part of the heavens, as if the goddess was pausing to remember, to grieve, to acknowledge what she had lost. After Orion's death, Artemis's relationship with her mother Leto became more important. Leto, who had suffered so much to bring her children into the world, who had been scorned and hunted and denied basic dignity because of Hera's jealousy, remained one of the few constants in Artemis's existence. The goddess might not need comfort or nurturing in the way mortals did, but she valued her mother's presence, her understanding, her quiet strength, which made what happened with Niobe so particularly personal and so absolutely unforgivable. Niobe was a mortal queen, wife of Amphion, who ruled Thebes, and she was blessed with what many would consider the greatest fortune any woman could have. 14 children, 7 sons and 7 daughters. They were all beautiful, all healthy, all talented. Niobe was, by any reasonable measure, fortunate beyond measure. But fortune was not enough for Niobe. She wanted recognition. She wanted glory. She wanted to be honored not just as a queen, but as something approaching a goddess herself. And she decided that her many children proved her superiority over the divine. There was a festival in Thebes honoring Leto, a celebration where the people would bring offerings to the Titan goddess, thanking her for giving birth to Apollo and Artemis, for surviving Hera's persecution, for being mother to 2 of the most powerful Olympians. The citizens prepared laurel wreaths and incense, ready to make their prayers and offerings at Leto's shrine. Niobe appeared at the festival and stopped it before it could begin. She stood before the assembled crowd, dressed in her finest robes, surrounded by her 14 beautiful children, and she spoke with the absolute confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences for anything. "Why," she asked the crowd, "why do you honor Leto? What has she done to deserve worship? She gave birth to 2 children, only 2. Artemis and Apollo may be gods, yes, but they are only 2. Niobe herself had 14 children. She was 7 times more blessed than Leto. Should not the worship be directed toward her, toward Niobe, who had proven herself far more fertile, far more favored by the gods? She gestured to her children as evidence. "Look at them," she said. "Look at their beauty, their strength, their nobility. Are they not proof of divine favor? Are they not superior to Leto's meager 2 offspring? If anyone deserves worship, if anyone deserves shrines and sacrifices and prayers, surely it is Niobe, not some titan who barely managed to birth a pair of twins." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Even mortals understood that boasting about being superior to gods was dangerous, that hubris invited nemesis, that pride came before destruction. But Niobe was their queen, and she stood before them radiant with confidence, surrounded by proof of her claims. Some in the crowd began to murmur agreement. Perhaps she had a point. Perhaps they should honor Niobe instead of Leto. The festival dissolved. People went home without making their offerings. Leto's shrine stood empty, unadorned, while Niobe returned to her palace in triumph, certain she had won some great victory. The news reached Olympus within hours. Leto heard of Niobe's boast and felt something that mothers throughout history have felt when their children are insulted, a fierce protective rage that made her own suffering pale in comparison. She had endured much in her life. Hera's persecution, the long wandering while pregnant, the difficult birth on a barren island. But she had always had her children's success to comfort her. Apollo and Artemis were magnificent, powerful, honored throughout the world. They were proof that her suffering had meaning. And now this mortal woman dared to belittle them. Leto went to her children and told them what had happened. She did not have to ask for revenge. She did not have to beg for justice. She simply told them the story, and their faces hardened with identical rage. Apollo and Artemis, who rarely acted in concert despite being twins, moved together with terrible purpose. They took up their bows, their silver and gold weapons that never missed, and they descended from Olympus toward Thebes with divine speed. They found Niobe's sons first, exercising in the gymnasium as young men of noble birth often did. The 7 boys were practicing athletics, running and throwing, wrestling and testing their strength against each other. They were laughing, confident, enjoying the prime of youth and health. Apollo appeared above them, visible only as a dark figure, silhouetted against the sun. He drew his golden bow and began to shoot. 1 arrow for each son. The first boy fell with an arrow through his heart, dead before he hit the ground. The second tried to run and took an arrow through the throat. The third attempted to shield his youngest brother, and both fell together, Apollo's arrow piercing through one body into the other. The 4th, 5th, and 6th died in rapid succession, Apollo's aim perfect, his arrows finding each target with lethal precision. The youngest son ran toward the palace, crying for his mother, begging for protection. Niobe appeared at the door and saw him stumbling toward her, saw Apollo's arrow already in flight. She reached out her arms, screaming for him to hurry, to reach safety, but the arrows struck him between the shoulder blades, just steps from the threshold. He fell at his mother's feet, and his blood spread across the polished stones. Niobe, who had boasted of her 7 fine sons, now had none. But the punishment was not finished. Artemis stepped forward, her silver bow drawn, and turned her attention to the daughters. The 7 girls had gathered in their mother's chambers, hiding from the violence outside, praying to any god who would listen for protection. They held each other and wept, knowing that whatever had killed their brothers was coming for them next. Artemis found them easily. Divine senses penetrate walls and closed doors. She shot through the windows, through doorways, through any opening that presented itself. Her arrows flew with the same merciless accuracy as her brothers. The oldest daughter took an arrow through the eye, the second through the heart. The third tried to hide behind a curtain, but Artemis's arrow found her anyway, piercing fabric and flesh with equal ease. The 4th and 5th sisters died embracing each other, a single arrow passing through both bodies. The 6th begged for her life, promising anything, offering anything, if only she might be spared. Artemis shot her through the mouth, silencing her pleas mid-word. The youngest daughter, barely more than a child, made no sound. She simply closed her eyes and waited. Artemis's arrow took her cleanly, a quick death at least, the single mercy in a slaughter devoid of mercy. When the killing ended, Niobe's 14 children lay dead. All of them. Every son, every daughter, every beautiful, talented, beloved child that she had boasted about lay cooling in pools of spreading blood. Niobe had nothing left. In the space of an hour, perhaps less, she had gone from supremely blessed to utterly destroyed. Her children, her proof of divine favor, her reason for pride, all were dead. The palace that had echoed with their laughter now echoed with her screams. Amphion, her husband, could not bear it. He took his own sword and drove it through his heart, choosing death over the unbearable pain of surviving all his children. Some versions say Apollo killed him too, an extra punishment for being Niobe's partner in pride. Either way, Niobe's husband joined her children in death, and she was left completely alone. For 9 days the bodies lay unburied. No one in Thebes dared approach them. Zeus had turned the citizens to stone, temporarily, a divine proclamation that this was God's business and mortals should not interfere. The bodies began to decay in the summer heat, visited by flies and carrion birds, untended and unmourned except by Niobe herself, who sat among them and keened her grief to the uncaring sky. On the 10th day, the gods themselves buried the children, taking pity on the corpses if not on the mother. Niobe, exhausted beyond reason, finally ate something, a piece of bread someone had left near her, and found the strength to move from her position among the dead. She left Thebes and walked to Mount Sipylus in her homeland of Lydia, to the place where she had been born, where she had been young and innocent before pride had consumed her. And there, on the mountain, she prayed to Zeus for the only mercy she could imagine, an end to feeling. Zeus, for once, granted a request without complication. He transformed Niobe into stone, a rock formation on the mountainside. But even as stone, she wept. Water seeped from the rock, flowing down like tears, a stream that never stopped, fed by snowmelt and rain and the eternal grief of a mother who had lost everything because she dared to compare herself to gods. The rock formation was still visible in ancient times. Travelers would point to it, this weathered stone that seemed to resemble a woman's face, and tell the story of Niobe, the queen who had 14 children and lost them all to divine vengeance. The water that flowed from the rock was said to taste of sorrow. The lesson was clear, driven home with 14 deaths. Mortals do not compare themselves to gods. Mortals do not boast of being superior in any way to the divine. And most especially, mortals do not insult the mothers of gods, because children will always defend their parents, and divine children have terrible tools for that defense. Artemis returned to her forests after killing Niobe's daughters. She did not seem troubled by what she had done. Niobe had insulted Leto. The children had been collateral damage in enforcing the lesson. The goddess who helped women in childbirth had killed 7 girls barely past childhood, and she felt no apparent contradiction. Protection and punishment were 2 sides of the same divine coin. Love and violence existed side by side without conflict in her nature. But not all of Artemis's interactions with mortals involved punishment. Sometimes she intervened to save, to protect, to offer unexpected mercy. The story of Iphigenia demonstrates this better than most. Agamemnon, king of Mycenae and leader of the Greek forces, was gathering his army at Aulis, a port in Boeotia, preparing to sail for Troy to retrieve Helen and punish the Trojans for Paris's violation of guest right. It was the largest military gathering Greece had ever seen. Ships from every city-state crowded the harbour, warriors trained on the beaches, supplies were loaded and checked. Everything was ready, except the wind. There was no wind. Day after day passed and the air remained still, the sea glassy and calm. Ships could not sail without wind, and the wind simply did not come. The Greeks waited, growing impatient, supplies dwindling, morale declining. Agamemnon consulted his seers, demanding answers. Calchas, the prophet, revealed the problem. Artemis had stilled the winds. She was angry with Agamemnon for an offense the king had barely noticed, but which the goddess considered unforgivable. Agamemnon had been hunting in a grove sacred to Artemis. This was his first mistake. Sacred groves were marked, not known, meant to be avoided, or at least entered with proper reverence and caution. But Agamemnon, focused on the hunt and confident in his position as king, had not been paying attention to whose space he was violating. His second mistake was shooting and killing a deer in that grove, a red deer, a creature under Artemis's special protection. The kill had been masterful, a single arrow through the heart, so perfect that Agamemnon boasted aloud that even Artemis herself could not have made a better shot. That boast, that comparison of mortal skill to divine, sealed his fate. Artemis heard it, and her rage was immediate and absolute. She stilled all winds across that region. The Greek fleet would sit in harbour forever, unless Agamemnon made proper atonement. Calchas delivered the goddess's price. Agamemnon must sacrifice his eldest daughter, Iphigenia. Only virgin blood would appease Artemis. Only the death of what Agamemnon loved most would balance the scales for his hubris. Agamemnon refused at first. He was a king, a father, a man who loved his daughter. He would not kill her for wind, would not spill innocent blood to speed a fleet to war. He would wait. The wind would come eventually. They could be patient. But the other Greek commanders pressured him. Odysseus, clever and ruthless, argued that personal feelings could not stand in the way of duty. Menelaus, his brother, whose wife's abduction had sparked this war, insisted that family must sometimes be sacrificed for honor. Achilles, young and eager for glory, cared nothing for Agamemnon's paternal feelings, and wanted only to sail and fight. The army itself grew mutinous. Warriors who had left families and farms to fight this war would not accept indefinite delay. Some threatened to return home. Others spoke of replacing Agamemnon as commander. The fragile alliance that held the Greek forces together began to fracture. Finally, Agamemnon relented. He would do it. He would sacrifice Iphigenia. But how to bring her to Aulis without revealing the terrible purpose? He devised a lie, a cruel fiction that would haunt his family long after his own death. He sent word to his wife Clytemnestra. Bring Iphigenia to Aulis. Achilles wishes to marry her before the fleet sails for Troy. Come quickly. Bring our daughter for her wedding. Clytemnestra, proud and pleased that her daughter would marry the greatest warrior of the age, made the journey to Aulis with Iphigenia and appropriate servants. Iphigenia herself was excited, nervous, dreaming of her wedding day, of her future with the famous hero. They arrived at the military camp and something felt wrong immediately. There were no wedding preparations, no flowers, no feast being prepared, no sense of celebration. Instead, there was tension, secrecy, averted eyes. Achilles himself did not know of any wedding and was confused when Clytemnestra congratulated him on his upcoming marriage. The truth came out in stages, revealed by servants who felt guilty, by warriors who could not keep the secret. Clytemnestra learned that her daughter had not been brought for a wedding, but for a sacrifice. Iphigenia learned that she was the price Artemis demanded for the fleet to sail. The reaction was horror and betrayal. Clytemnestra raged at her husband, accusing him of the worst kind of treachery, luring their daughter to her death under false pretenses. She threatened him, cursed him, swore that if he did this she would see him dead in return. Iphigenia wept and begged her father to spare her, reminding him of her childhood, of the times he had held her and called her his precious girl, of all the reasons a father should protect a daughter rather than kill her. But Agamemnon, having made his choice, would not reverse it. The army was watching. The commanders were waiting. Artemis's demand stood. He hardened his heart and ordered the sacrifice to proceed. What happened next varies depending on the source. In some tellings, Iphigenia was dragged screaming to the altar, while her mother wailed, and Achilles, who had grown to genuinely care for the girl even without marriage between them, tried and failed to protect her. In these versions, Agamemnon himself wielded the knife, raising it high above his daughter's throat, ready to drive it down and spill her blood on Artemis's altar. But in that final moment, just as the blade began to fall, Artemis intervened. The goddess appeared in a shimmer of light, visible to all the assembled Greeks, and she placed her hand on Iphigenia's head. The girl disappeared, vanished from the altar, and in her place lay a red deer, throat already cut, blood already pooling. The sacrifice was complete, but it was animal blood, not human, that had been spilled. The wind rose immediately, a strong, favourable breeze from the exact direction needed to carry the fleet to Troy. The sails snapped and filled. The ships strained at their anchors, eager to be gone. The price had been paid, or seemed to have been paid, and Artemis had released her hold on the wind. Calchas proclaimed it a miracle, a sign of divine favour. Agamemnon, relieved beyond measure that he had not actually killed his daughter, declared it proof that the gods supported their cause. The Greeks prepared to sail with renewed enthusiasm, certain now that the campaign was blessed. But Clytemnestra did not see a miracle. She saw betrayal. Her husband had been willing to kill their daughter. The fact that Artemis had intervened at the last moment did not change his intention, his readiness to trade his child's life for favourable wind. She said nothing in the moment, but her silence was not acceptance. It was the quiet that comes before a storm, the dangerous calm that warriors learn to recognize as a warning. And Iphigenia? The stories differ on what became of her. In some versions, Artemis transported her to Tauris, a distant land on the shores of the Black Sea, far from Greece and the war that had nearly killed her. There, Iphigenia became a priestess in Artemis's temple, serving the goddess who had saved her, performing rites and rituals, living a life separated from her family and homeland. She performed human sacrifices herself, a dark echo of the sacrifice she had nearly been, killing foreigners who landed on Tauris's shores as offerings to Artemis. Years later, her brother Orestes would come to Tauris, fleeing the furies that pursued him for killing Clytemnestra in revenge, for Clytemnestra killing Agamemnon in revenge for his attempted sacrifice of Iphigenia. Family violence upon family violence, the curse of the house of Atreus playing out across generations. Orestes and Iphigenia would recognize each other in that foreign temple, and together they would escape back to Greece, the priestess abandoning her post, the fugitive finding unexpected salvation. In other versions, Iphigenia did not become a priestess, but something more. Artemis, impressed by the girl's courage and dignity in the face of death, offered her immortality. Iphigenia became a minor goddess herself, a companion to Artemis, joining the eternal band of virgin huntresses that surrounded the goddess. She would hunt forever, young forever, free from the mortal world that had tried to kill her. Still other accounts, more cynical, suggest that Artemis never intervened at all, that Agamemnon killed his daughter, that the deer was a storyteller's fiction added later to soften the horror, that Iphigenia died screaming on that altar, and the wind rose because Artemis was satisfied with mortal blood, not because divine mercy had been shown. But most retellings favour the version with divine rescue. Perhaps because people need to believe that gods, even harsh gods like Artemis, can show compassion. Perhaps because the story of Iphigenia saved is more comforting than the story of Iphigenia slaughtered. Or perhaps because Artemis, for all her fierce demands and terrible punishments, did understand something about protecting young women, about intervention, about mercy offered at the last possible moment. The story reinforced certain truths about Artemis. She demanded respect, particularly in her sacred spaces. She punished hubris without hesitation, but she could also be moved to pity, could spare the innocent, could recognize courage and respond to it with unexpected kindness. She was never predictable, never soft, but neither was she blindly cruel. There was logic to her actions, even if that logic was divine and difficult for mortals to pass. And there were other myths, smaller stories that filled out the portrait of this goddess who walked boundaries between civilization and wild, between protection and punishment, between mercy and wrath. There was the story of the Aloadi giants, Otus and Ephialtes, who tried to storm Olympus itself, piling mountains on top of each other to reach the heights where gods lived. They intended to seize goddesses for wives, to take Artemis and Hera by force. Artemis tricked them, transforming into a white deer and running between the giants as they prepared to attack each other. They threw their spears at her, but she dodged aside at the last moment, and the brothers' weapons struck each other instead, killing both. There was Cypriotes, a boy from Crete who accidentally saw Artemis bathing. Unlike Actaeon, Cypriotes was very young and clearly stumbled upon the scene without any intent to spy. Artemis, in a moment of comparative mercy, did not turn him into an animal to be torn apart. Instead, she transformed him into a girl. He lived the rest of his life as a woman, a strange punishment that removed his male gaze while preserving his life. There were the various river gods and minor deities who pursued Artemis, trying to court her despite her vows. She rejected all of them, sometimes with polite refusal, sometimes with violence. Alpheus, the river god, tried to embrace her at a festival. She and her nymphs smeared their faces with white clay, making themselves indistinguishable from each other, and Alpheus could not tell which one was the goddess. He gave up and left, frustrated but unharmed. Artemis could be clever as well as cruel. She was also deeply connected to childbirth, despite or perhaps because of her own virginity. Women called on her during labor, seeking her aid, her comfort, her intervention. She was Artemis Locaia, helper in childbirth, and Artemis Kuratrophos, nurse of youth. Midwives invoked her name. Pregnant women made offerings at her shrines. Those who survived difficult births credited her. Those who died in childbirth were said to have been struck by her silver arrows, not as punishment but as a form of sacred death, a crossing into the realm beyond. This connection to childbirth was paradoxical. A virgin goddess who never bore children herself became the deity women most trusted during that dangerous passage. But perhaps it made sense in a strange way. Artemis had been present at her own brother's birth. She understood the threshold between life and death that childbirth represented. She knew pain, knew danger, knew how close women came to dying when they brought new life into the world. And she honored that experience even if she never shared it personally. She was also Artemis Potnia Theron, mistress of animals. This title captured something essential about her relationship with the wild. She was not simply goddess of the hunt, though she was certainly that. She was mistress, controller, protector, and punisher of all wild creatures. She walked among bears and wolves without fear. Deer approached her without fleeing. She understood animals in ways no one else could, understanding that went beyond language or logic into something more fundamental. When she hunted, she did so as part of the natural order, predator taking prey as wolves take rabbits, as hawks take mice. The hunt was not separate from nature. It was nature's most essential expression. Death served life. The killed fed the killer. Nothing was wasted. Everything had purpose. Artemis embodied this understanding completely. Her sacred spaces were scattered across Greece and beyond. Broaron in Attica held one of her most important sanctuaries where young girls performed rituals before marriage, dancing as bears in her honor, offering her the years of their youth before taking on the roles of wives. Ephesus in Anatolia boasted the magnificent Temple of Artemis, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, though the Ephesian Artemis was a strange hybrid, incorporating elements of older mother goddess worship, depicted with multiple breasts or egg-shaped symbols representing fertility. Sparta honored her fiercely, with festivals that involved young men being whipped at her altar, their blood an offering, their endurance proof of worthiness. Delos remained sacred to her always, the island of her birth. Pilgrims travelled there from across the Mediterranean, bringing offerings, telling stories, seeking blessings. The island thrived on its connection to the twins, and Artemis never forgot that it had sheltered her mother when no other place would. Her festivals were numerous and varied. The Brauronia involved young girls wearing saffron robes and performing the bear dance. The Munichia celebrated her with torch races and round cakes decorated with candles. The Elaphebolia honored her with deer-shaped cakes. The Lafria involved a procession and the throwing of living animals onto a great bonfire, a sacrifice that seemed horrific to modern sensibilities but which ancient Greeks saw as appropriate for a goddess of both wild nature and controlled fire. Hunters prayed to her before every expedition, asking for her blessing, promising to honor the kill, swearing to waste nothing. They left the choicest parts of their game at her shrines, hearts and livers still steaming, acknowledging that their success was her gift. Those who forgot to make these offerings found that their arrows missed more often, that game became scarce in their hunting grounds, that accidents befell them in the woods. Women prayed to her for different reasons: for protection of virginity, for success in childbirth, for healthy children, for the strength to endure what had to be endured. Artemis was not a goddess of comfort, but she was a goddess of endurance, of survival, of fierce independence that could sustain you even when nothing else could. Women who needed that strength called on her, and sometimes she answered. Her relationship with her brother Apollo remained complicated throughout eternity. They were twins, born together, forever linked, but they were also opposites in many ways. Apollo represented civilization, music, order, the rational mind. Artemis represented the wild, the hunt, instinct, the natural world. He was sun, she was moon. He was cities, she was forests. He was words, she was silence. Yet they could work together when needed. The slaughter of Niobe's children demonstrated their unity. When their mother was insulted, they responded as one, his golden arrows and her silver arrows flying in concert, matching each other, death for death. They protected each other fiercely. Apollo's interference in Artemis's relationship with Orion, however misguided or cruel, came from a place of protective concern, a desire to preserve his sister's independence even at terrible cost. They appeared together in many stories, usually as a team dealing with threats or dispensing divine justice. When the giant Tityos tried to rape Leto, both twins shot him down with their arrows. When Niobe boasted, both punished her. When heroes needed divine guidance, they often appeared together, Apollo offering prophecy and wisdom, Artemis offering protection and practical aid. They were the divine twins, forever paired even in their differences. Artemis never married, never took a lover, never wavered from the vow she had made as a 3-year-old child sitting on Zeus's knee. Her virginity was not simply physical, it was spiritual, philosophical, essential to her entire being. She was eternally herself, belonging to no one, defined by no relationship except those she chose, free in a way that few gods and fewer goddesses ever achieved. This independence made her both admired and feared. She represented an alternative to the traditional path women were expected to follow: marriage, children, submission to male authority. Young girls who loved to run and hunt, who chafed at the restrictions placed on them, who dreamed of freedom, saw in Artemis a goddess who embodied their longings. She proved that a woman could be powerful without a husband, could be complete without children, could define herself entirely on her own terms. But that independence came with a cost. Artemis was alone. She had her nymphs, yes, but they were followers, not equals. She had her brother, but they were different people with different lives. She had her mother, but Leto could not always be present. The fierce solitude that defined Artemis, that made her strong and free, also made her isolated in ways that perhaps even she did not fully understand. The Orion story, in all its variations, hinted at this. For a brief moment, Artemis had found someone who matched her, who understood her, who shared her passions without trying to change or control her. And that connection, that possibility of something beyond solitude, had ended in death. Whether she killed him herself or Apollo engineered it or the gods punished his hubris, the result was the same. Artemis returned to solitude, and she never again allowed anyone that close. Perhaps this was why she was goddess of boundaries, of liminal spaces. She stood at the edge between civilization and wilderness, between city and forest, between cultivated and wild. She guarded thresholds, the threshold of puberty as girls became women, the threshold of marriage as maidens became wives, the threshold of birth as mothers brought children into the world. She existed in the spaces between, never fully part of any single realm, forever marking the boundaries that others crossed. Her worship continued long after the classical age of Greece ended. The Romans adopted her as Diana, keeping most of her attributes while softening some of her fiercer edges. Diana became popular among slaves and plebeians, goddess of those who lived on the margins, who existed outside the power structures of society. The name Diana meant heavenly or divine, and she was honored in groves and forests throughout Italy, especially at Lake Nemi, where her sanctuary involved a strange custom. The priest could only be succeeded by someone who killed him in combat, a primitive and violent tradition that echoed Artemis's own violent nature. Christianity attempted to suppress her worship, but traces remained. The temple at Ephesus, that wonder of the ancient world, was destroyed, but the cult of the virgin goddess transformed in unexpected ways. Some scholars suggest that the veneration of the Virgin Mary incorporated elements of Artemis worship, that people simply transferred their devotion from one virgin protector to another. The practices changed, the names changed, but the need for a fierce female divine protector remained. Even now, millennia after the last formal sacrifices were made at her altars, Artemis endures in cultural memory. She appears in stories, in art, in the names people give their daughters, in the symbol of the crescent moon that still represents feminine power. She is invoked by those who love the wilderness, who fight to protect wild places and wild creatures. She is claimed by feminists as an icon of female independence and autonomy. She is studied by scholars trying to understand ancient religion, ancient gender roles, ancient attitudes towards sexuality and power. She would perhaps be satisfied by this lasting influence, though she would likely prefer the forests to the libraries, the mountains to the museums, the living worship of those who walk alone in wild places over the academic analysis of those who merely read about her. Because ultimately, Artemis is not a goddess of books or temples or intellectual understanding. She is a goddess of experience, of the moment when you stand alone on a mountainside and feel absolutely free, of the instant when an arrow leaves the bow and you know it will strike true, of the threshold moments in life when everything changes and nothing will ever be the same. She is the wild that still exists inside civilization, the part of human nature that refuses to be tamed, the fierce independence that every person feels at some deep level, but that so few manage to fully embody. The stories told about her, the myths that have survived and spread, are not meant to be comfortable or reassuring. They are meant to remind us that the divine is not always kind, that nature is not gentle, that freedom requires sacrifice, that independence has costs, that boundaries must be respected even when we do not understand them. Artemis represents truth without comfort, reality without softening, the world as it is rather than as we might wish it to be. And in that unflinching honesty, in that refusal to accommodate or compromise, in that absolute commitment to being fully herself, regardless of what anyone else wanted or expected, Artemis becomes something more than just a goddess of hunting or wilderness or the moon. She becomes an example, a challenge, a question posed to anyone who encounters her stories. Are you brave enough to be fully yourself? Are you strong enough to stand alone? Are you free enough to define your own path regardless of what others expect? The wild places remain. They are smaller now, more scattered, more threatened by human expansion and environmental destruction. But they endure, these forests and mountains and untouched spaces where civilization has not yet reached. And in those places, according to those who pay attention, according to those who listen carefully on clear nights when the moon is bright, there are still signs of her presence. A deer moving through trees with impossible grace, the flight of an arrow that finds its mark against all odds, the sound of dogs baying in the distance, the feeling of being watched by eyes you cannot see, the sudden understanding that you're not alone in the wild, that something ancient and powerful shares these spaces with you, that you are a guest here and should behave accordingly. These are Artemis's signatures, subtle and easy to dismiss as imagination or coincidence. But to those who honor the wild, who respect the boundaries between human and natural, who understand that some spaces are sacred and some privacy is absolute, these signs are acknowledgement. The goddess sees you. The goddess notes your respect or your violation. And the goddess, as she always has, will respond accordingly. So as you drift towards sleep tonight, as these stories settle into your mind and fade into dreams, remember the lessons Artemis taught across generations of myth and worship. Remember that freedom requires commitment. Remember that boundaries exist for reasons. Remember that the wild is not cruel, but neither is it kind. It simply is. Remember that independence is possible, that autonomy is achievable, that you can define yourself rather than being defined by others. And remember that somewhere in some forest you may never visit, on some mountain you may never climb, a goddess still runs with her hounds and her nymphs, still draws her silver bow, still guards the spaces between civilization and wild. She is eternal, she is untamed, she is free. And perhaps, in your own way, you can be too. If this kind of storytelling brought you peace tonight, if you found rest in these ancient stories, if you appreciate having mythology to fall asleep to, then feel free to like the video and subscribe. But only if it actually helps, only if you find value in these long journeys through myth and legend. And as always, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Good night, sleep well, and may your dreams be as wild and free as Artemis herself.